Dear friends, a few months ago, my children hugged their father again. For years, they had only memories. There was no communication, letters didn't arrive, and we didn't know if he was alive. And then, after 5 years as a hostage of the Belarusian regime, he walked free. My name is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and I'm not a politician by a choice. I am a wife, I am a mother, and I am Belarusian who just wanted to live normally. 6 years ago, my husband Sergei Tikhanovsky was a blogger. He traveled across Belarus with his camera asking ordinary people simple question: how do you live? People told him about empty factories, about salaries that cannot feed a family, about fear, about the problems of normal life. For that, he was arrested. I remember the moment when I learned he wouldn't come home. I remember holding my phone, reading the message over and over again. Arrested, again, then charged, then sentenced to 19.5 years in prison. 19.5 years. My children were very small. They asked me, "Mama, when will Papa come back?" What do you answer? Do you tell them the truth? That in Belarus, telling the truth is a crime? Or do you protect their childhood for one more day? I decided that if my husband was imprisoned for speaking, then I would speak louder. I registered as the presidential candidate in his place, not because I was brave, but because I was angry, because I was heartbroken, because I couldn't explain to my children why we did nothing. I traveled across Belarus and I saw hope in people's eyes. I saw grandmothers standing in long lines under the sun just to sign our petition. I saw workers, teachers, students whispering, "We are with you." Tens of thousands came to our rallies. It became a popular movement for change. "We are reborn," read one banner. And then came the election of 2020. Belarusians voted for change. They voted for me, and we won. We all know it, and the regime knows it. That night, the internet was shut down. Peaceful protesters were beaten. Women were dragged by their hair. Teenagers were tortured in prison cells. I remember one woman who told me how she stood in the detention center corridor and heard men screaming while police laughed. She said the sound will never leave her. And this is not politics. This is cruelty. And soon after, I was forced into exile. I had 15 minutes to decide: prison or live in my country to continue the fight from abroad. I left. You know, the hardest moment of my life was not crossing the border. It was knowing that my children would grow up away from their home and without their father. Knowing that our family would be scattered because one man refuses to give up power. And it wasn't just about our family. Today, there are more than 1,200 political prisoners in Belarus. Teachers, journalists, students, pensioners. People like Mykolai Statkevich, who refused to be forcibly deported and is now held incommunicado. Like journalist Katerina Andreeva, who was arrested while reporting from the 2020 protests. Like Belarusian Polish activist and journalist Andrzej Poczobut, who was awarded the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought by the European Parliament last year. Imagine living with one of your relatives in prison. Every morning you wake up and check the news, hoping not to see your loved one name in the list of the dead. And this is the daily life of Belarusian families. And while Belarus suffers under dictatorship, our land is also being used as a launchpad for Russia's war aggression against Ukraine. I want to say clearly, Belarusians stand with Ukraine. Our people sabotaged railways to stop Russian tanks. Our volunteers fight alongside Ukrainians because we know that we are in this fight together. While political prisoners in Belarus are tortured with freezing temperatures, ordinary Ukrainians are suffering because Russia is weaponizing the winter cold. The fate of Belarus and Ukraine is intertwined. If Belarus becomes free, Ukraine will be safer. If Ukraine wins, Belarus will have a chance. This is why our struggle matters not only to us. But I'm here not only to tell you a sad story, I'm here to ask you to act. When you leave this room, you will return to your offices, parliaments, newsrooms, and you have power, so use it. Don't normalize the regime. They have been deceiving you for the last 30 years. You cannot trust them. Do not trade principles for convenience. Do not forget the names of our hostages. Demand the unconditional release of all political prisoners. Strengthen sanctions against those who torture and imprison. Support Belarusian civil society, the independent journalists, the human rights defenders, the activists in exile and underground in Belarus. Help the families of prisoners. Help the children who grew up without their fathers and mothers. And hold the regime accountable. Impunity breeds more violence. Silence gives permission. I often think about the day I will be able to return to Minsk with my children. I imagine a Belarus where no one is imprisoned for asking, how do you live? This is not a dream too big. This is a normal European country. Belarusians have shown incredible courage. They marched peacefully. They endure tortures. They continue to resist. But courage alone is not enough. We need solidarity. We need you. And one day, when Belarus is free, we will remember those who stood with us, not only in our darkest times, but until the very end. Stand with Belarus. Stand with Ukraine. Stand with freedom. Thank you.
Que viva. Que viva Venezuela libre, claro que sí. Good afternoon. On January 3, U.S. military forces seized Venezuelan narco-terrorist Nicolás Maduro and flew him to New York to face federal charges. Broadcasters around the world asked, is this the beginning of the end of his authoritarian regime? And my answer is yes. I believe Venezuela will become a free and democratic country soon. But that future did not begin with Maduro's capture. It really began on July 28, 2024, when the people of Venezuela overwhelmingly voted against him. When 70% of Venezuelans said yes to María Corina Machado and Edmundo González Urrutia, yes to democracy, and yes to freedom. It began even earlier when María Corina won the primary election in 2023 with more than 93% of the votes. I was part of those campaigns. But I couldn't celebrate the victory of July 28 because that night I was locked inside the Argentine embassy in Caracas. I was a hostage. I was 8 years old when Hugo Chavez became president. I remember my family went silent that day. They knew that Chavez would use democracy to destroy democracy. But if Chavez achieved one thing, it's that he got Venezuelans' interest in politics. In 2007, in my first year at university, I watched millions of young Venezuelans mobilize against his constitutional reform and win. I was part of that. Politics became an act of self-defense against authoritarianism, and still. I met Maria Corina Machado shortly after Chavez died in 2013 during the opposition campaign. Maduro stole that election. A few weeks later, Maria Corina called me after being a volunteer, and she asked me to join her new political party, Vente Venezuela. I quit my job that day and started immediately. Over the next 10 years, I went from being the youngest and least experienced person in the room to director of international relations for Maria Corina Machado's presidential campaign. It felt like a full circle moment because when I met her 12 years ago, she had that role that I had in that moment. So no, I did. As an international coordinator, I traveled constantly, and every time I went to the airport, I knew they might arrest me. My colleagues used to say, in a dictatorship, everyone has a number. One day, they are gonna call your number. They called mine on December 6, 2023. Maria Corina had just won the primary election. I was in the middle of a press conference when my watch started vibrating. They are coming for you, run. I got into a car with my colleagues, Claudia and Henry, and we sped to a nearby embassy. The ambassador accepted us and tried to put us at ease for a couple of hours. He asked how long we expected to stay. This won't take long, I thought. It was 2 weeks. I had heard about this happening to other people, but it's very different when you are the main character in the story. The first thing you learn is that this is real. They could put you in jail if they wanted. It doesn't matter what the truth is. You will never see an arrest warrant. All that matters is what they say. And they said I was a terrorist, I was a conspirator, and a traitor. We stayed silent, and on December 20, 2023, they released us in a prisoner exchange. But that was the beginning. We were not free. They had canceled our passports and frozen our bank accounts. I had to report to a judge every 2 weeks, like so many others. But as I mentioned, that was just the beginning. Next January, the regime officially disqualified Maria Corina from running for president. There was no trial, no evidence, and no due process. It was a political ban, not a legal one. She was simply a big threat to Maduro. After that, the regime started targeting our campaign leaders one by one. What was our crime? Managing a campaign and winning an election. Maria Corina decided to keep fighting to defend the people's mandate in the primaries. Then, on March 20, 2024, I was at the office when a new press conference announced that they were issuing another arrest warrant for me and 10 of my colleagues. 2 of them, Henry and Ignora, were abducted by the political police. The rest of us had to run. I raced to the Argentine embassy. During the afternoon, more arrived. Magali, the head of the campaign, Claudia, the communications coordinator, Humberto, the election coordinator, Omar, the political coordinator, Fernando, the alliances advisor, and me. I looked around and thought, well, we have everyone we need here. This is the new campaign office in the embassy. Time was running out. Maria Corina could not be a candidate. Neither could Corina Lloris, her second attempt. Finally, Ambassador Edmundo González Urrutia stepped up to be on the ballot. We knew the opportunity that was in front of us. They never expected us to keep campaigning from inside the embassy while Maria Corina and Edmundo were traveling around the country. But we did. because it was a survival decision, the only possible one. On election day, I remember standing on the embassy balcony overlooking Caracas. It was the first time I couldn't vote in my own country. That day, one of my missions was coordinating 64 international observers to visit the country. The regime deported every single one of them. But we had nearly 1 million Venezuelans volunteers at polling stations around the country. They collected the tally sheets, scanned them, and uploaded them to the cloud. We made history. That night, the regime declared Maduro the winner. But we knew the truth. We won by a landslide. After that, everything changed. Maria Corina had to go into hiding. Edmundo González was forced into exile. The regime was ready to attack anyone connected to the campaign before, during, or after the election. People were sent to prison, forced into exile, or pushed into hiding. In simple but painful words, state terrorism. We were still stuck inside the embassy. Over the next 10 months, they did everything they could to break us and force us to surrender. They cut off the electricity and water completely. We spent 5 months without power, depending on a solar panel. 5 months without running water. We drank water from the ambassador's pool in the worst unhealthy conditions. Without refrigeration, or food rotted. We rationed everything and sometimes ate only once a day. And our neighbors were those who you never expected to have, the embassies of Russia and North Korea. I remember gathering as a group to discuss possible scenarios in that moment. Maybe the regime will allow some of us to leave, but who would stay and who would go? We decided sometimes that I always remember very proudly. No one leaves unless everyone leaves. Then, in December, 9 months in, we realized that they had turned the neighbor house into a police surveillance post with masked men pointing assault rifles straight at us. This was no longer an embassy. It was a diplomatic prison. And I realized that dying was a real possibility. Of course, I couldn't sleep. I was terrified. We all were, knowing that at any minute, the regime could storm the embassy and take us to prison or worse. But we decided to resist, and fear became our engine. We were free in mind and spirit. In those final months, our only source of hope was the wild macaws, or guacamayas, wild parrots that flying overhead in Caracas. They started coming down to visit us. They would sit on our shoulders and our arms. At first, they were a symbol of trust and freedom. And then, in May 2025, more than 400 days after we had arrived to that embassy, they felt like a signal from the universe that it was time to fly. We had already planned to escape twice with no success. But the regime made one massive error. They had cut the electricity to our building, and that meant their security cameras were off too. We figured out where the blind spots were and made our escape. They discovered it 4 days later. After we were safe, we learned the regime had been building a tunnel underground to extract us, to make us disappear or kill us. But our escape proved that the regime is not perfect. They are divided. There are people inside Maduro's system fighting for democracy in secret. Without their help and without the international support, we would not have escaped. I want to especially thank the US government for their leadership in our rescue and all the courageous people that risked their lives to help us, including the Argentine government that protected us. I don't like to think about what would happen if we stayed in that embassy much longer. But international law is supposed to protect people like us. It should not be a shield for governments to attack their own people. Diplomacy and international law are not useless, but their rules have not been effective in confronting criminal authoritarian regimes. What do you tell survivors who are hiding in an embassy because they are supposed to be protected, but no one is actually protecting them? What happens when, before the eyes of the world, an embassy becomes a prison? What do you tell the political prisoners' families who are waiting for the international community to do something in the midst of despair? Why do we keep arriving too late? What is diplomacy for if it's not used to stand up to injustice? Today, I'm forced into exile like many others. So I understand something very clearly. You are never truly free until your country is free. The threats against you are permanent, but you keep fighting for those who cannot do it. And we have a mantra: no one is left behind. That's why we are working harder than ever, because Maduro is gone, but Venezuela is not liberated yet. There are still nearly 800 political prisoners in jail and 30 million Venezuelans inside and outside the country getting ready for the final day of liberation. As I was writing this speech, two of my colleagues I mentioned earlier, Henry and Dignora, were released after nearly 2 years in prison. But today I want to take a moment to recognize the brave Venezuelan people, to recognize my colleagues, and to recognize every exile and political prisoner who has been released, and those who are still in jail, as well as their families, especially those who are today, as we speak, on hunger strike in Zona 7 in Caracas, demanding freedom. Today, I call for the total, immediate, and unconditional release of all political prisoners, civilian and militaries, because there is no transition with repression. And I want to be clear on this idea. There is no transition with repression. It's not possible to talk about transition with repression. It is the brave Venezuelan people who give me hope for the future of Venezuela. I trust them. We trust each other. And that is why I will keep fighting until the very end. Hasta el final. Venezuela será libre. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much. Thank you. Viva Venezuela libre. Libertad. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I speak as someone whose life has been shaped by discrimination, neglection, and exclusion. Coming from Rojava, Western Kurdistan, what some people call northeastern Syria, the Kurds' right to live in dignity under self-governance or independence doesn't come only from the sacrifices we made fighting global jihad or ISIS, the Islamic State. We deserve dignity because we are rooted in our homeland in the Middle East. Dignity is not something earned through war. It's something every people inherently deserves. We built self-defense not for power, we built it for survival and paid one of the highest prices. I started covering front lines of the war against ISIS in 2014 when I was working for a Kurdish TV station. I was just 21 years old when I documented mass graves committed by ISIS, bombing attacks prepared and sent to our cities by the current jihadi regime in Syria, which was back then called Al-Nusra Front. I have documented stories of slavery, abductions, and sale of women and young girls as sex slaves, and the unforgettable genocide against the Yazidi Kurds in Sinjar Mountain, named in Kurdish as Chiaye Shingali. I saw thousands of displaced families fleeing with nothing but their children in their arms, some mothers holding the dead bodies of their babies to their chests. In that moment, I remember tears pouring from my eyes, just as sweat poured from my skin on that hot summer day in August 2014. I saw what jihadis do when they believe is no one watching, but I was watching. Then after 4 months of that, ISIS took me hostage and threw me into an underground prison. For 280 days, in 7 different prisons, and 100 days of solitary confinement, I lived inside the system I had been reporting on. I saw how they operate from the inside, how they weaponize religion, erase identity, reward obedience, and punish difference. I saw how cruelty is normalized and how fear is organized. I cannot even begin to count the number of times our captors would blindfold us, line us up, and act like they were going to kill us, and then not. One of the times, a jihadi from Libya held a pistol right next to my head and pulled the trigger. The shot was so loud that for a moment I thought it was really the end. But seconds later, they were laughing. That was their sense of humor. Mocking us by playing their favorite execution scene. It was a psychological torture. It was a game to them. I survived those 9 months in captivity and got liberated thanks to the brave Kurdish female and male fighters of the defense units, the same who fought ISIS and liberate the region from the jihadi ghost. But many with me didn't survive. When I was finally released, I promised myself that I would dedicate my life to defending minority groups, because I had seen what happens when the world decides some lives are negotiable, and how West's normalization of extremism today with the jihadi failed de facto government in Syria is creating devastating consequences for us. In December 2024, when the dictator Assad left power, the Western world was so relieved, they said, finally, the brutal dictator is gone. Now, al-Jolani will bring stability to the region. What a naive fantasy. For decades, we have been brutally attacked on 2 fronts. On one side, by the government, Assad, and the other side by the religious extremists, jihadis like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Nusra, and so on, from different jihadi factions supported by Turkey and Qatar. So where does Jolani come from? This new leader who will bring stability to the region? He falls into the second category. He's a Salafi extremist. He comes from Al-Qaeda, then he built the Islamic Caliphate in Syria with a direct mandate from al-Baghdadi, who had already back then established it in Iraq. And after he moved to Syria, he built al-Nusra Front, then Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, then Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, known as HTS. All these mentioned factions are jihadi Salafi terror groups. I have spent years of my youth tracking these factions and know their past very well. Jolani is not a mystery to us, or to the West, or to the UN. The US State Department had a $10 million bounty on his head. And by the way, they still didn't delete the social media posts regarding that bounty. But Jolani's extremism did not disappear with his new suit and colorful tie. All that changed is his uniform, and maybe his beard style is a bit shorter, maybe 2 centimeters shorter than before. He wants to hear. I saw and I still see to this day how he deceives journalists and diplomats with his sugar-coated speeches and statements, while on the ground, we witness something else, completely the opposite. Committing horrific massacres in less than 1 year. 3 horrific massacres targeting Christians, Kurds, killing more than 8,000 people and arresting other thousands of them. He's issuing performative presidential decrees, beautiful on paper, but meaningless in real life. Ink on paper that doesn't protect a single minority life. This is not a reform. This is a wolf in sheep's clothing. In the last months, I have watched with huge frustration as Western leaders who speak eloquently about democracy and human rights shake hands with these extremists. A former German Minister of Defense, now holding a senior position at the European Union, recently met with Jolani. This was right after that Jolani started a military campaign against the Kurds. She promised him 620 million euros without any clear public enforceable conditions at all. When I watched the news, I felt like she was rewarding him for all the massacres he commits. These officials who legitimize jihadi-linked leaders in the name of stability are not choosing justice and peace. They are choosing an illusion of short-term convenience. You cannot fight extremism by empowering its architects, and you cannot promote democracy while ignoring minority rights. Minorities are not a side issue. They are an early warning system of every failing state. I have seen this in my own life. 14 years ago, as a high school student, an administrator threatened to expel me simply because of speaking Kurdish to a friend. Not shouting, not protesting, just speaking my own language. As I said, this kind of discrimination is an early warning system. It was only 1 year later that 5,000 Kurds were massacred. We didn't feel safe under the rule of dictator Assad, but today we are suffering a worse de facto regime. And the West believes that we should integrate with these militant extremists. They push us to sign fragile agreements to avoid danger, fragile agreements with jihadis who practice taqiyya, concealing their beliefs to avoid danger till they gain more power and find the right moment to attack the non-believers. The non-believers like you all sitting here in this room. Sorry to say, but this is how they see us. This is how jihadis look to the outside world. It makes no sense to integrate with a jihadi failed state known as Syria. The Kurdish people are liberal, democratic, and openly anti-jihadist. We want to live free from religious coercion, free from violence, free from fear. And that's what we deserve, not just because we fought against ISIS and liberated huge territories from terror, but because we have the right like anyone else. We carry the voices of all minorities who refuse extremism. Until Druze, Jews, Alawites, Christians, Yazidis, Assyrians, and other minorities can live in safety, dignity, and equality, the entire region will remain unstable. We do not ask for pity. We ask for courage and consistency. Even in the United States, where politicians hardly agree on anything, they can agree on this. Recently, the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democrat Richard Blumenthal introduced Save the Kurds Act to affirm that the Kurdish people must be protected. Not as a favor, not as a repayment, but because the safety of the Kurdish people is essential in the region. When people are targeted for who they are, societies begin to fracture. When people are protected in their differences, then peace has room to grow. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kai Mareska, and I'm a student at École Musée in Geneva. The empty chair on this stage is dedicated to Mikhail Krieger, a Russian opposition activist and political prisoner who has been jailed for defending human rights in Russia and for protesting the regime's war on Ukraine. For decades, Krieger has advocated democratic freedoms and the release of political prisoners. He co-founded the Union of Solidarity with political prisoners and is active in various other Russian human rights groups. Krieger has repeatedly faced persecution and detention for his activism and participation in peaceful protests. Despite the risks, he continued to speak out against injustice and repression. In February 2022, after Vladimir Putin launched Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Krieger publicly denounced the war. On November 3rd, 2022, Krieger was seized in Moscow by mass security officers, thrown to the ground and detained. His home was searched and he was placed in pretrial detention for 2 months. His crime was posting online against Putin's regime to protest Russia's war on Ukraine. The state indicted him under false charges of inciting hatred and justifying terrorism. On May 17, 2023, a military court sentenced Krieger to 7 years in a penal colony. Even behind bars, Krieger has continued to resist Putin's regime through acts of quiet resistance. In September 2025, he began a hunger strike in protest of his conditions, garnering international attention and celebrity support against his unjust imprisonment. Most recently, in November 2025, Mikhail was transferred to an even more brutal special penal colony for 6 months. He was punished for simply greeting someone through a fence while on a walk. Today, we say to Mikhail Krieger, while you are confined to a prison cell, we gather here at the Geneva Summit to honor your courageous fight against tyranny and to demand your freedom. We gather to say that you are not alone. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Grace Jin Drexel, and on October 10th, my father, Pastor Ezra Jin, was arrested by the Chinese authorities along with 27 other pastors and church leaders of Zion Church. 18 total remain in prison today. This crackdown represents one of the largest takedown of an independent Christian congregation in China since the Cultural Revolution. A sweep so brazen, it has drawn international condemnation. I urge the Chinese government to release all of Zion Church members immediately and unconditionally. To understand why my father is in prison, you must understand that leadership in China in recent years has embarked in a systematic campaign to achieve total state control of religious life over China through what the government calls Sinozization of religion, officially framed as making religion more Chinese. Let me be clear, Sinozization is not about making religion more Chinese. It is repression, plain and simple. Christians in China have been Chinese for generations. We already have Chinese Bibles, sing indigenous hymns, and are led by Chinese pastors. But beginning in 2018, a wave of persecution and crackdown on all religions began on the auspices of Sinozization. It included removing of crosses and replacing them with portraits of Xi Jinping, switching out hymns and with revolutionary party songs, rewriting sermons to align with socialist core values, and shutting down or even leveling churches. This crackdown has targeted Muslims, especially the Uyghur communities in Western China, Buddhists, and other religious groups. my father founded Zion Church in 2007 with a mission to be faithful to God's word and to serve the communities around us. They are not opposed to the Chinese authorities, but have sought to enrich the society. They merely ask to be free from the control of the Chinese Communist Party, a self-identified atheist party, and the sacred decisions of the church. Like faithful Christians everywhere, my father's church holds firm the position that thou shalt have no other gods before me. In 2018, Zion Church became a target specifically because church leadership refused to install 23 facial recognition cameras inside the sanctuary to track and monitor believers. In response, the police brutally seized the church buildings and imposed an exit ban on my father, forbidding him from leaving the country. Yet even repression cannot extinguish faith. My father and his congregation did not give up in the face of these actions. They developed a hybrid online-offline model, and beyond anyone's wildest imagination, when COVID hit in 2020 and all gatherings were forced to a halt, Zion Church's online model allowed our church gatherings to expand nationwide, launching 100 church meeting places across 40 cities in China. The church grew to the largest size it's ever been, reaching 10,000 people daily. Perhaps that's what embarrassed the CCP. Now, a new and more severe wave of persecution is underway for my father's church and other churches in China. My father is now in prison because he held firmly to his faith and because he truly loved and cared for the people and served the community out of love and not control. My father's church served the vulnerable, gave to the poor, and ministered to the broken families. My father is not a very confrontational person. He is firm in his convictions, but is also the gentlest of souls. Unlike the stereotypical image of an Asian father, my father doted on me and my brothers liberally. He would always give me a big hug and greet me dramatically, "Oh, my beautiful daughter." We would often take evening walks as a family, arms linked, and watch Korean singing competition that often moved all of us to tears. I have rarely seen him angry or critical of anyone, which often benefited me growing up. He was always patient, always kind, and always giving people grace. And he had an incredible sense of humor and optimism, even in prison. However, now my father and the 17 detained leaders of Zion Church are made to sleep without beds on the cold floor. They are subject to endless interrogation and sleep deprivation as punishment. They do not have access to the doctor's prescribed medication. Many of them, including my father, have severe health concerns and are growing worse under prison conditions. I have not seen my beloved father in person in 7 years. He was not there to walk me down the aisle in my wedding, and we have never danced the father-daughter dance. I now stand before you in the most vulnerable state, 5 months pregnant and traveling across the world to plead for my father's release. I do not know, and I do so knowing the grim reality that many prisoners of the Chinese government never see their families again. Since I began advocating for my father and the release of other detained church leaders, my family has also experienced transnational repression. That is, we have been harassed and targeted by the Chinese government abroad to sow fear. We have received threatening phone calls and have been watched and followed in Washington, D.C. I am sometimes fearful. After all, I seek to expose the second most powerful nation in the world. Yet, I believe that we are asked to take courage and to speak truth, and that the God who made heaven and earth will be by our side. Similarly, I urge all of us here today to take courage, to use your voice and your influence in whatever sphere to speak the names of those detained. my father, Pastor Ezra Jin, Pastor Gao Yingjia, Pastor Yin Huibin, Pastor Wang Lin, and all the others who are detained. Pastor Gao Chenfu of Light of Zion Church, Pastor Wang Yi of Early Rain Covenant Church, etc. Call for the Chinese government to release all of Zion Church's leaders immediately and unconditionally. Do not accept China's trampling of human rights and universal freedom with silence. If left unchecked, Beijing's wave of repression will reverberate around the world for freedom of religion and human rights as a whole. As a Christian, I draw strength in knowing that my God is a good God, and that even in these bleakest moments, God will be able to use for good. As my father wrote in prison, God has indeed used his power to uphold us. I believe that God is also testing us during this time, like refining silver, painful but full of love. God will not abandon us. Our work and our prayers are not in vain. I am grateful for everyone here today, grateful to the Geneva Summit, and for all those who worked so hard to make this event happen. Thank you to all the leaders of my country and the leaders around the world who stand with us. And most of all, thank you to all the countless brave individuals who confronted oppression in China and around the world, serving as an example for us all. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the next speech, interpretation is available in English and French. Headphones can be found on the tables or next to the chairs. Please select your preferred language. Channel 1 for English, Channel 2 for French. Thank you.
My name is Junior, just Junior. I was born in Cuba in 1982. The generation before mine had names inspired by the Soviet culture. Cosmonauts were all the rage. Yuri, Alexei, even Laika. When our parents got tired of that, they started giving us the names they heard in American movies. I was lucky. They named me Junior. But I had friends named Danger or Usnavi, like the United States Navy. I did theater in Cuba for over 20 years. At first, they were harmless comedies. But when you try to seriously represent the reality of a country like Cuba, it's impossible to avoid the plays becoming absurdist or political theater. And I ended up doing political theater. I think my parents should have named me Danger. My teachers lived in panic with each of my works, but they taught me a trick. As long as my characters spoke and not me, I had an alibi. As long as it all sounded like a metaphor or allegory, I was more or less safe. That's how I survived for a while. In a work called Blood, they mentioned political prisoners. In another called Semen, I criticized indoctrination in schools. In Passport, I was talking about the exodus of young people fleeing the country. Playwrights of my generation discovered that the officials in charge of censorship were only trained to detect metaphors. But when plays directly attacked the regime, they were somewhat lost. They wondered, what did they mean? Then came my most political work of all, Jacuzzi, where it wasn't a character who declared himself against a revolution. It was myself. The character wasn't called Jose or Pedro. He was called Junior. I crossed the red line, and I crossed it for good. Until then, I was just an inconvenient writer. Watched, yes, with state security breathing down my neck, yes, but until then, it was something they thought they could control. Because theater is something that happens in small and closed spaces. On November 27, 2020, artists took to the streets. We stood in front of the Ministry of Culture in La Habana. It was something that had never happened before in Cuba. We demanded the release of other detained young artists, the young people from the San Isidro movement. We demanded end to censorship, an end to repression, and the start of a peaceful dialogue to find a democratic and sovereign solution to an unpopular and exhausted regime. That day was beautiful, beautifully naive. We truly believed that we could change the country where we were born with songs and poems. The regime treated us as if we were worse than a pandemic. I was accused of being a CIA agent. The Cuban regime is not usually very original. 6 months later, on July 11, 2021, hundreds of thousands of Cubans took the streets to protest. They sang "Homeland and Life" rather than "Homeland or Death," the official slogan. The country's president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, gave an order to fight against his own people. They beat us up. A young man died. He was shot in the back by armed police. My friends and I were thrown into a garbage truck and taken to jail. The cameras of the FN News Agency recorded that moment. That's why we were released the next day, but hundreds of young people remained imprisoned. Some received sentences of up to 20 years in prison. Upon my release from prison, I created a platform on Facebook, Archipelago. We wanted to show that Cuba is more than just an island, that it is plural, diverse, and that we all have the right to dream about our future. We asked for permission to march peacefully with white flowers, but they never allowed it. My house was surrounded. They cut off my phone and internet. They beheaded pigeons in front of my door. They blocked the windows with flags. They threatened my wife and my mother-in-law, and they assured me a 27-year prison sentence. I had to leave the country. I came to Spain with my wife. I was not the Messiah that many expected. I was more like Jonah, and I was swallowed by a big fish called exile. The Cuban regime tries to make us believe that when we leave, we disappear. My son stayed in Cuba, my only son. I haven't been able to see him since I left. He used to be 1.5 meters tall. Now he's over 6 feet tall and already has the shadow of a mustache. My father died a year ago inside Cuba. I couldn't say goodbye either. And I'm not the only one this has happened to. I didn't come here to play the victim. I've been lucky. I'm alive, and I am free. That's why I prefer to talk about those who remain inside Cuba, trapped in the belly of a much darker and more bitter fish. A few days ago, 2 young men from Holguín, the city where I was born, were arrested. They're also accused of working for the CIA. Is there anyone from the CIA in this room? When all of us in Cuba who have been accused of working for the CIA receive our pay, Cuba's GDP will be larger than Switzerland's. These young men are named Ernesto and Camille. The crime was having a YouTube channel called El Cuartico. They spoke of freedom and democracy, two words considered subversive in Cuba. They also had more followers than the country's president, although that's not a merit. Anyone has more followers than Miguel Díaz-Canel, who came to the presidency with a single vote, the only one that matters in Cuba, that of Raúl Castro. The regime prefers to speak of two other words, sovereignty and anti-imperialism. They repeat them a lot. Interestingly, those words did not appear in 1968, when Soviet tanks crushed the Prague Spring. They also did not appear when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Cuba is the Olympic champion in moral gymnastics. Sometimes invading is wrong. Other times it is a special military operation. Today, there's a lot of talk about Cuba. The president of Mexico says she fears a humanitarian crisis. Now? Were the last 5 years normal? In Cuba, 3 times as many people die each year as in the Dominican Republic, a country of similar size. More than 1.5 million people have had to flee the island since 2021. The regime says they are not fleeing because of political problems, but there is nothing more political than hunger. Cuba is not on the verge of a humanitarian crisis. Cuba is experiencing a chronic humanitarian crisis. We're often told, I hope you can get through this on your own. But we are hostages, and the hostages don't free themselves. That only happens in the movies. I'm not here to ask for invasions. I never had held a weapon. My son is inside Cuba, and I fear for him. But the international community must understand that inaction also kills. Looking the other way is taking sides. It's time to support the people in Cuba, not the government. And the people are crying out for change. When I talk to my friends in Cuba, many tell me, we're afraid, yes, afraid that everything will stay the same. And I think the worst thing that could happen to us is that nothing happens. Because if that dictatorship remains in power for 3, 4, 5 more years, perhaps there will be nothing left to save. And when someone asks in another forum like this one, who did something, silence will also count as an answer. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. It's a great honor for me to be here. I'm a journalist from Russia. For more than 20 years, I worked for state Russian television. But when Vladimir Putin announced his so-called special military operation, I was working on the main evening news broadcast. To be honest, at that moment, I was a part of huge Kremlin propaganda machine that spreads lies and hides the truth from people inside Russia. But the war against Ukraine was a point of no return for me. I couldn't not remain silent any longer. So on March 14, 2022, I went on a live broadcast and shouted, "No to war, stop the war." In my hands, I held a poster that read, "No war, stop the war. Don't believe propaganda, they are lying to you here, Russians against the war." That image, thank you so much. That image traveled around the world within minutes. My protest lasted only 6 seconds, but these 6 seconds were the truth of the endless stream of Kremlin lies. They arrested me immediately. My lawyer told me, according new Russian law, so-called fake news about Russian army, I could face up to 15 years in prison. But I was ready to go to prison for the right to speak the truth and oppose the war. The Russian authorities didn't know how to handle my case. So they tried to ignore it, hoping I would get scared, stay silent, and just quietly leave the country. But I didn't stay silent. I continued to speak out against the war and publish anti-war posts. After the Russian missile strike killed children in the Ukrainian city of Vinnytsia, I protested again, this time near the Kremlin. I put 2 baby dolls at my feet and held the sign that read, "Putin is the killer. His soldiers are fascist. How many more children must die before you stop?" At 6 o'clock in the morning, around a dozen police officers broke into my home and took me to a detention center. I spent night in a cell. The next day, a judge placed me under house arrest where I have to wait my verdict. That was the moment when I perfectly realized if I don't want to spend all my life in Russian prison, I have to escape. So, 9 days before the trial, I cut off my electronic bracelet and crossed the border illegally with my daughter under cover of night. Our escape was extremely dangerous. We changed cars 7 times. We spent night moving through the forest and plowed fields, getting stuck in the mud and hiding from border patrol vehicles. The stress was unbearable, but we escaped. And today we are living in France as a refugee. Since then, Russian authorities designated me as a foreign agent and an enemy of state. They sentenced me in absentia to 8.5 years in prison. My former husband, who supports so-called special military operation, used court to revoke my parental rights. And yet, I consider myself lucky. I managed to escape from Russia. Thousands of others did not. According to human rights organizations, there are around 2,000 political prisoners in Russia now, more than in the latest Soviet period. Today, I stand before you not to speak about myself. I stand here to speak about them. Look at this photo. This is Maria Ponomarenko, a journalist and mother of 2. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison for just one anti-war post. In prison, she was beaten by guards. She was psychologically abused. She was forcibly given antipsychotic drugs. She was put in solitary confinement at least 13 times. The conditions were terrible. There were rats running around. And even after all of this, Russian state keeps bringing new charges against her. This is 15 years old political prisoner, Arseny Turbin, the youngest political prisoner in Russia. He was arrested for handing out leaflets. Leaflets that ask one simple question: do you really need president look like this? He was interrogated alone, without his parents, without a lawyer. Investigators added the transcript and added confession he never made. Then they sentenced him to 5 years in prison for participating in a terrorist organization. 5 years, he was only 15. And municipal deputy Alexei Gorinov, he was the first person in Russia to be sentenced for speaking out against the war. In March 2022, he suggested holding a minute of silence for children killed in Ukraine. In any normal democratic country, that would be seen as simple human gesture. But in Russia, this small act of compassion was enough to send him to 7 years in prison. In prison, they secretly recorded him, and for anti-war remarks he made in private conversation, they extended his sentence for 3 more years. This is pediatrician Nadezhda Buyanova. Her case shows how far this repressive system is willing to go. She was arrested after the mother of a 7-year-old patient reported her. Allegedly, she made anti-war comments during a routine medical appointment. For that unproven remark, the state sentenced her to 5.5 years in prison, 5.5 years for something that had never made happen. Engineer Igor Baryshnikov was sentenced to 7.5 years for just 2 social media posts. Can you imagine 2 Facebook posts? Now he's in critical condition, quite literally hanging between life and death. His lawyer said, if Igor Baryshnikov is not included in an exchange this year, we may lose him. I could list the names of political prisoners endlessly. The 30 director Evgenia Berkovich, playwright Svetlana Petrichuk, Navalny's lawyers Vadim Kobzev, Alexei Lipser and Igor Sergunin, politician Lev Schlossberg, historian Alexander Skobov, journalist Antonina Favorskaya, mathematician Azat Miftakhov, artist Lyudmila Razumova, stand-up comedian Artemia Stanin. These are not isolated cases. They are part of systematic campaign of political repression. Many of them risk of dying in prison. They urgently need international attention. They need diplomatic pressure. They need your voice. Please help to save political prisoners in Russia. Thank you so much for your attention.
Distinguished guests, freedom fighters and human rights activists from all over the world, ladies and gentlemen. This is my second time speaking at the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, and I'm very grateful to the organizers for making it possible for me to speak to you today. In 2022, I spoke about a country that I call home, Uganda, a nation of 50 million people living under the violent military dictatorship of General Yoweri Museveni, who has for 40 years twisted the law and used the military to stay in power. I told you of how I ran for president against him in 2021, how it was the most violent political campaign yet, and how he massacred hundreds of our people on the 18th and 19th of November 2020. How he shut down the internet on the eve of the election, imprisoned me inside my home for weeks, and then declared himself winner of the 2021 presidential election. Now, it is 2026, and here I am again, speaking to you at the Geneva Summit. Nothing has changed for the better, only going from bad to worse. Despite what happened in 2021, we were driven by hope to give it another try. So in 2025, I announced that I was running for president again. For 112 days, I traveled across the country campaigning, and the population turned up overwhelmingly. Yet again, our campaigns were violently attacked, our supporters were murdered, we were blocked from reaching many places, and were also blocked from several media stations. As usual, Museveni shut down the internet again, this time 3 days to the election. And what happened thereafter was not an election, but a military operation. The election was so rigged to the point that even at the polling station where Museveni voted for, he got much more votes than the actual registered voters in the register. Our polling agents in several places were arrested and whisked away. Several of our party officials were arrested and many abducted. 2 female deputy presidents of our political party were abducted and held incommunicado in a military barracks for 3 weeks before being thrown into a prison where they are languishing right at this moment. The military was deployed on our streets, shooting on spot whoever dared to challenge the criminality. It was under these circumstances that Museveni yet again declared himself winner of the election, this time with over 70% of the vote. Right now, I'm speaking to you while in hiding. This is because as soon as the election was finished, Museveni's son, who is also chief of the Ugandan military, issued an order to take me to him, dead or alive. The military acted on his order and raided my home. They tortured my family members, humiliated and undressed my wife, accusing her of hiding me. Meanwhile, they were recording and taking pictures of her, which the military chief later on shared on Twitter and bragged about capturing my wife. They also took over my home and surrounded it, and they are occupying my home as we speak right now. My wife and children had to flee the country for fear of their lives. I am in hiding, but I don't want to be in hiding. It was necessary though, so I can stay alive and be able to speak to you right now. I've said it before and I say it again, that I'll resurface at the right time in my country. I feel like the international community has abandoned us. They've ignored us and they've left us to the fate of dictators. When I ran for president in 2021, Museveni and his thugs denied their crimes. They killed our people and denied it. They tortured people and denied it. They raided our houses and denied it. General Museveni has been a smart dictator because he puts on a suit, goes to the West and to the UN, speaks very nicely about democracy and human rights, but realistically, he does not mean any of those. He talks about our so-called Human Rights Commission in Uganda, but the same person closed the UN Human Rights Office in Uganda 2 years ago because they dared to question him about his atrocities. Now that is how he has been able to maintain a facade of democracy for 40 years and counting. But now Museveni is 83 years old, and his 51-year-old son, Muhoozi Kainerugaba, commands our military, the Uganda People's Defense Forces, more like Uganda's defense against his own people. And he's effectively in charge. And like his father, Muhoozi does not play the role of a good dictator. He openly and shamelessly says despicable things on social media. On Twitter, he openly confesses and brags about committing atrocities against the people of Uganda. When he was summoned by Parliament, he called Parliament a house of clowns and fools, and he threatened to arrest all of them. He describes judges of the Supreme Court of Uganda as clowns in wigs, and he has threatened to crush all journalists that dare to criticize his actions. In April last year, he abducted, detained, and tortured my close friend and bodyguard called Eddie Sebufu, also known as Eddie Mutwe. He later on posted on Twitter naked pictures of Eddie, boasting that Eddie Mutwe was in his basement learning Museveni's mother tongue, Bunyankole. Last month, he bragged about killing 22 of my friends, and he said that he's praying that I am the 23rd person for him to kill. In other words, Museveni and his son no longer fear international retaliation for their crimes. They've been so emboldened by your lack of action. They know that they can murder their own people, imprison them, torture them, remove their fingernails, push needles down their testicles, and nothing will happen to them. Now, they're using rape as a weapon. Boys and girls, men and women, people of all ages have reported being sexually assaulted by Muhoozi's military. And it's not rare. The majority of the people that they capture and unlawfully imprison have reported being raped, whether men or women. It is no longer possible, ladies and gentlemen, for the international community to deny Museveni's violence and atrocities. It's all over social media. And today, I am talking about it to you. Now, this is our call to action. The way I see it, if the international community continues to be complacent, then Uganda will go from bad to worse. Museveni and his son's military will massacre many more innocent Ugandans. You, ladies and gentlemen, in the Western world, will be forced to grapple with millions of Ugandan refugees pouring into your countries. And maybe then, the international community will come and commiserate with the people of Uganda, just like they did after the genocide in Rwanda, but it was too late. The second option is that the international community rises to the occasion. You stand by the values that you profess, democracy and human rights. You can rein in on General Museveni and his son through targeted sanctions, as well as financial and legal pressures. Ladies and gentlemen, Ugandans are not seeking for pity. Ugandans are only seeking to see the world take action against the individuals that have violated their rights for far too long. Those that have abused democracy with impunity should be the starting point. Please sanction these individuals. Sanction General Museveni. Sanction General Muhoozi. Sanction all the police and military officers that are responsible for gross human rights violations. Sanction those commanders. Sanction the judicial officers that have aided criminality through deliberately misinterpreting the law or skewing it. Those that normalize electoral fraud. Those that remand to prison suspects that should actually be sent to hospital. Sanction these individuals because their combined efforts in the last election effectively give autocracy a blank check to rule over the people of Uganda for 5 years. We call upon the international community to treat General Museveni exactly how they treated Idi Amin, because Idi Amin did what he did to Ugandans for only 8 years. Museveni has done much worse to the people of Uganda, and it has been for 40 years and counting. Because of the inaction of the international community, Museveni's mode of dictatorship and human rights violations is being seen as acceptable in the region, and it must be stopped before it is exported to other countries in the region and in the continent. We ask the international community not to recognize Museveni's regime because it is not legitimate. Please terminate any forms of cooperation with this government because he is not legitimate. On our end, as the people of Uganda, we are committed to non-violent means of changing our country, non-violent means of putting an end to this 40-year-old dictatorship. And you can be sure that the people of Uganda will sooner or later free themselves, because oppressed people cannot stay oppressed forever. With your help, friends, with the help of the international community and development partners, we can change our country. We can liberate Uganda before it is too late. I thank you for listening to me, for God and my country.
Something's happening. Patience. I can go. Bonjour à tous.
Excellencies, human rights defenders, distinguished guests. What an honor it is to be with you today at this 18th edition of the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. We are gathered here for an important moment, a powerful moment, the presentation of the 2026 International Women's Rights Award. This prestigious distinction honors women who have demonstrated exceptional courage and leadership in defending the rights of women and girls. Before her, defenders from Iran, Congo, Pakistan, Gambia, Iraq, Somalia have received this award. Women who refused to remain silent. Women who stood firm. This year, the 30 human rights organizations that co-sponsor the summit have chosen to honor a remarkable figure, Marzieh Hamidi, an accomplished athlete, an unwavering activist, a woman of rare courage. For generations of Afghan women, living already meant surviving. But since the Taliban seized power in August 2021, this reality has turned into a systematic assault on their rights. Girls have been excluded from classrooms, women have been erased from public life, dissenting voices have been silenced. We must call this by its name. It's a gender apartheid. And yet, despite the fear, despite the threats, despite the organized erasure, some refuse to disappear. Some refuse to be silent. Marzieh is one of them. Her story is one of resilience. Born in Iran to a family of Afghan refugees, she grew up in exile, in uncertainty, in the fragility of precarious status. As a child, she was expelled to Afghanistan after an attempted escape to Germany. 2 years later, back in Iran, she was denied schooling because she was undocumented. The doors of education were closed to her. She opened another. It was then that she discovered Taekwondo, a discipline that offered her what the world had denied her: confidence, strength, freedom. In 2019, after returning to Afghanistan, she quickly established herself as a multiple-time national champion. Her career took off. Her future began to open. Then the Taliban returned, and with them the bans, the restrictions, the silence imposed on women, including female athletes. To continue living, training, hoping, she was forced to flee once again. Today, she is rebuilding her life in France, where she trains with the French national team. But if Marzieh is a champion on the mat, she is above all a champion for women's rights. She refuses to use her voice only for herself. She raises it for all those who are being silenced. She turns her visibility into a platform, her determination into a fight, her courage into a message, and that courage comes at a cost. For her activism, she has received death threats. She lives under permanent police protection because even in France, she is not safe. Those who threaten her are not joking. And it is profoundly shameful that a woman who defends freedom, equality, and human dignity must still fear for her life on French soil. But she does not step back. She does not give up. In September, she published her book, They Will Not Have My Silence, with Baptiste Bérard-Proust, a title that is a promise, a powerful testimony of her journey, the story of a struggle, a tribute to all those women who refuse to be erased. I am fortunate to know this woman. I admire her strength. I admire her determination. I admire her steadfast refusal to yield to fear. Her courage compels us. Her fight commits us. For her unwavering dedication, for embodying the indomitable spirit of Afghan women, the Geneva Summit is proud to present her with the 2026 International Women's Rights Award. Please join me in welcoming her with all the respect, emotion, and admiration she deeply deserves. Marzieh Hamidi, ladies and gentlemen.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. Everything I do so instinctive and so passionate. Every word I move so descriptive like an adjective. I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it. I got facts over tracks, this and that. Spitting slow, spitting fast, not the roast, I could gas. Think I'm okay at last, but I don't know if that can erase all the past. And the pettiness, a reflection of the emptiness. Hilarious, you think you're with my time, you're delirious. Mysterious, because you are behind a fake exterior. Inferior, you know I'll always be a bit superior. Get off of me, this ain't no humble brag. I want you to hear words, you can say them back. I want you to feel free from the chains at last, and to believe in what you got, it was built to last, yeah.
Now that I've been put through hell, I never got anyone's help. I had to do it all myself.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not here to tell you a sad story. I'm here to tell you the truth as I lived it. A truth about what happens when a system decides that women must disappear and boys must be reshaped into weapons. I know exactly who I was. but the regimes around me could not tolerate a woman with an identity. This is how I learned something early. Power does not fear weapons, it fears women who refuse obedience. I was born Afghanistani, I was born in Iran. But the country where I was born never accepted me as its own. I spoke the language, I lived there, and still I was treated as a temporary, repressible, invisible. This is how identity is erased, not by denying your existence, but by denying your rights. Taekwondo saved me. As an athlete, I learned something powerful. When you train your body, you train your mind, and when a woman controls her body, she becomes very difficult to rule. When I joined the Afghanistan national team, I saw the system clearly. They told me I was a gift for Afghanistan. They praised my talent, but I watched how other girls were treated, ignored, controlled, reduced to decoration. They invested in boys, they managed girls. They asked me to cover my body during training, not for performance, not for safety, but because they feared judgment. After I won a competition, they begged me to wear a hijab for the medal ceremony, not because I fought that way, but because powerful men were watching. Like you are watching me, but I'm not wearing it. That was the moment I understood they were not afraid of my results, they were afraid of my visibility. Then the Taliban came. I remember standing by the window in Kabul. When people started running home, the announcement came. The Taliban were in the city. And suddenly, women disappeared. The street empty of us. When I went outside fully covered, I felt something terrifying. Men looked at me like I did not belong there, like my presence was a mistake. That was the moment I understood Afghanistani women were not just oppressed, we were being erased. At the same time, my mother began receiving calls from our family north of Afghanistan. They were crying. They are taking our boys by force from Badakhshan. They take them to madrasas, to Kabul, to Pakistan. Girls erased, boys taken, families powerless. And now, I want to say something with courage. The world keeps saying open the schools. I said it too. Sorry. But today, I say this without fear. It is better for schools to remain closed than for girls and boys to be sent to Taliban madrasas. Because those are not schools, they are terrorist factories. Girls do not learn science or freedom, they learn silence. Boys do not learn critical thinking, they learn obedience and violence. This is not education, this is how a generation is destroyed. Let me be absolutely clear. We don't want to live with the Taliban, we want a free Afghanistan, an Afghanistan with democracy, with a state where religion does not control women's body or people's mind. Yes, Afghanistan is a Muslim country, and it is also a country of many ethnicities, beliefs, and identities. All of them deserve protection, all of them deserve dignity, all of them deserve a democracy that respects belief, not one that weaponizes it. Stop calling the Taliban an Islamic Emirat. They are not an Emirat, they are not a government, they are terrorists. Do not normalize them with language. Nothing can normalize them. They were terrorists yesterday, they are terrorists today, and they will remain terrorists tomorrow. I know this not as theory, but as lived reality. They crossed the borders to silence me. They sent rape threats, death threats, messages describing exactly how they would kill me. Not because I carried a weapon, but because I spoke. This is what terrorist looks like. And yet, the world remains soft with terrorists because calling them terrorists has consequences, because recognition requires action, because normalization is easier than responsibility. That is why I am here today to say this clearly. The international community must recognize gender apartheid as a crime, not as a concept, not as a slogan, but as a crime under international law. Because gender apartheid is not a culture, is not religion, is not tradition. It is a system of domination. Recognizing gender apartheid as a crime will change everything. It will block the political normalization of the Taliban, it will delegitimize their rule, and it will finally deliver justice to Afghanistani women. This is not symbolic, this is strategic, this is legal, this is necessary. As an athlete, I learned something early. A woman controls her body cannot be ruled. That is why they ban women from sport, because discipline creates resistance, and resistance threatens power. Today, I live under police protection, not because I am violent, but because I refuse silence. That is the cost of truth under terrorism. Then I spoke about something else. I spoke about sport, about the Afghan national cricket team. I say this clearly. You cannot sit with terrorists, work with terrorists, represent terrorists, and pretend you're neutral. You cannot normalize terrorism and call it sport. And this is important. Sometimes the danger is not only the Taliban, it is the lobbyists, the institutions, the people who normalize them, give them platforms, and help them look acceptable. After I spoke about this, the threats begins. Call, messages, warnings. People ask me today, why were they so angry? That they were ready to kill me, to rape me. The answer is simple. Because first, I am a woman. Second, I am a free woman. And third, I am against their ideology. Fourth, I know exactly what they are doing. This is what terrifies them. My lawyer asked me, are you sure you want to continue this fight? It will be long, because the justice is always long. And it's dangerous. I did not hesitate. I said yes, because I have been fighting injustice since I was a teenager. And I will not stop now. Today, I live under police protection not because I choose violence, but I refuse silence. I left Afghanistan to be safe, and yet the same ideology followed me to Europe. Still, I am here. Today, you give me this award. I accept it, not as an honor alone, but as responsibility. And I dedicate it to the women of Afghanistan who are being erased in real life, and the women of Iran who are beaten and killed for refusing compulsory control over their bodies. Different regimes, same ideology, control women, erase identity, call it order. So do not ask us to coexist with terrorists. Do not ask us to compromise with gender apartheid. And do not ask us wait while generations are destroyed. We are not asking for inclusion, we are demanding liberation. And liberation has never been polite. Thank you.
Félicitations, Marcia, et au nom de la trentaine d'organismes qui se parrainent cet sommet, on vous remercie pour votre courage, pour cet discours.
In the name of the 30 human rights organizations here, we would like to thank you for your speech. We congratulate you for your fight against the gender apartheid in the terrorist regime in Afghanistan and Iran.
And for your clarion calls to action for us all, on behalf of the brave women on the front lines of the struggle against one of the most brutal forms of oppression in the world today, the gender apartheid being imposed on the women of Afghanistan and Iran by those terrorist regimes. Thank you for giving them voice and for being with us here today. The very least that our countries can do is to not shake the blood-soaked hands of their oppressors. This week and next week, right next door, in the halls of the Palais des Nations, the architects of repression of Iran will be taking to the podium. The atrocities that Marcia and Masih Alinejad described are an indictment not only of those criminals taking to the podium, but of all the nations in the free world not holding them to account. It should be the names of the victims you heard described today echoing in the halls of the United Nations, not the voices of their oppressors. The courageous women of Iran and Afghanistan are fighting not only for their freedom, but on behalf of us all. Indeed, the mass domestic repression of these terrorist regimes, if left unchecked, metastasizes from domestic repression into external aggression, into transnational repression, as you heard about from speakers earlier today. And this has hit close to home in Canada as well, and in many free nations. If he was with us in person, my mentor, Professor Kotler, the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and one of the first speakers here at the Geneva Summit 18 years ago, he used to come and speak here every year. He cannot be with us in person here today because he is subject to a transnational repression plot by the Islamic Republic of Iran, threatened by assassination, simply for speaking out for human rights. So the struggles that the brave women of Iran and Afghanistan are leading on the ground, if we do not support them, those same terrorist regimes will come to attack us here, wherever we live. And we know exactly who are behind these attacks. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps were behind the targeting of Masih. They were behind the targeting of Professor Kotler. And they are the ones brutalizing the people of Iran in the streets today. They should be designated as a terrorist organization and their affiliates on our soil prosecuted. Canada, the US, the European Union have designated them as terrorist organization. The United Kingdom and other free states should be encouraged to do so as well. So don't just walk out of the Islamic Republic's speeches at the Palais des Nations this week and next. That would be a good first step. Sanction them, designate them as terrorist regime. They should not be allowed, those individual architects of repression, to enjoy the freedoms abroad that they crush of Iranian citizens at home. The Supreme Leader Khamenei and his criminals visiting here in Geneva, including Abbas Araghchi, Qasem Garibabadi, Afsaneh Nadipur, should be subject to Magnitsky-style targeted sanctions for their human rights violations and blocked from ever stepping foot anywhere else. This should be their last trip to any democratic nation. It is a shame that they are in Switzerland. They should never step foot in any free society again. They cannot use our banks, our businesses, and our beaches while butchering the Iranian people, and they should be subject to targeted Magnitsky sanctions. But this discussion about Iran, about Afghanistan, is a microcosm of all the cases we heard discussed on the stage today. We are witnessing a global authoritarian culture of corruption and criminality underpinned by impunity, where the dictators of the world are meeting next door, while the international community far too often stands silent in the face of their atrocities. Each and every one of our brave summit speakers here today came with a message, giving words to the unspeakable and finding the courage to share what is happening in their homelands and in their hearts, a cri de coeur for action. And so we must call on our governments to raise all the cases you heard about today, publicly, prominently, persistently, at every opportunity, whether at the UN or beyond it. And even at the UN, our democratic nations are often given the opportunity to talk about these cases, talk about these atrocities, to raise the plight and pain of political prisoners and their families fighting for their freedom, but choose not to do so. So whether in the Human Rights Council, in resolutions, in statements, at the Universal Periodic Review, or bilaterally with the states that are often causing these harms that they meet with anyhow, they should be raising the cases of these political prisoners and demanding their immediate and unconditional release. Again, these free nations are far too silent when they have the opportunity to do so. The very least they can do is be raising the names of these dissidents and these victims to these regimes and demanding their freedom. But taking action for human rights is not only for governments to do, it is not only about laws, but about lives. And not just about how we litigate, but about how we live. Each of us here today can do our part in our own way, whether that is speaking to our elected officials, writing for our local newspapers, or posting on social media. Many of the released political prisoners who've taken to this stage after finding freedom year after year at the Geneva Summit often talk about how this solidarity from around the world, something that might be as seemingly small or ordinary as the act of sending them a letter when they were in prison, actually had an extraordinary effect. Because writing that letter, or writing about them in a paper, or posting about them on social media, simply mentioning their name on a stage tells them when they're in prison that they're not forgotten, that they're not alone. And it also tells the perpetrators and those oppressing them that they are being watched and that their crimes are not being forgotten, that the world cares, and that we will not relent until they are free. And while that day may seem too distant, and while it is otherwise easy to succumb to cynicism and despair after hearing all of the atrocities described today and the government inaction that underpins these crimes, I conclude this conference with hope. Because when I look into the audience and I see the heroes who spoke today and all the members of civil society who have come together to support them, I see living, fighting proof that freedom prevails in every part of the world. We saw Leopoldo Lopez, who emerged from the torture of Ramo Verde prison in Venezuela to found the World Liberty Congress. Aram Akil, who survived ISIS captivity to become a leading voice for the Kurdish people. Kim Yumi, who escaped North Korea, perhaps the most repressive totalitarian state, to give voice to those still suffering there. And we heard from Blessing Malunga, who resisted persecution in Zimbabwe and prosecution for his journalism, to take the stage and speak the truth and commit to continue to fight for media freedom. So we see that across every continent, each and every person who spoke today personally embodies that hope for the future and for freedom. And because of them, I believe that with your help, a future Geneva summit will likewise see the political prisoners highlighted today, like Pastor Ezra Jin, like those in Russia, highlighted by Marina, and all those who spoke of the prisoners in Venezuela, Vietnam, Cuba, Iran, Belarus, Hong Kong, that eventually they will be here to take the stage in Freedom and Geneva Summit. And in Pakistan as well, in the imprisonment of Imran Khan, all those being persecuted by regimes engaging in oppression around the world, that we will see them in solidarity here on stage. Because as Martin Luther King Jr. used to say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I would add that it is because of the brave, noble, and inspiring individuals who spoke earlier today, those dissidents on the front lines of the struggle for our collective shared values and the future of humanity. It is because of them that this moral arc continues to bend. So may all the painful testimonies we heard today may not only be an act of remembrance, but a remembrance that, like these brave heroes, we must always act. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we close the 18th Annual Geneva Summit, I have the pleasure of choosing 3 names from a raffle. So my colleague Louis will give it, and the winner of the raffle, those who participated, will get at the registration desk this incredible sweatshirt, which says, "Fight like a girl," and it's, you know, it's from the woman from Iran. So I have the privilege and to name the first lucky winner is Esther Zimudzi. Esther Zimudzi, please go to the registration desk to collect your prize. Then we have in very small writing, but Luigi Framiacomi. If I'm reading it right, Luigi Framiacomi. Excuse me for getting the name a bit wrong. And the third name winner of the raffle of the prize is François Logiacomo. François Logiacomo. Please go to the registration desk. Congratulations on receiving a very meaningful reward. Friends, to conclude, after an emotional day like this, it is easy to feel the weight of injustice, but I believe there are real reasons for hope, and you saw them here today. You saw them here today. Now, dictators today are not so confident, they're defensive. Regimes that jail poets, that arrest teenage girls, that censor students are not strong. They're afraid. And when a government fears a song or a scarf, it reveals its fragility. Second, the information monopoly is broken. A video from Tehran, testimony from Khartoum, a message from Hong Kong, within minutes they reach the world. Now, it's true that regimes try to shut down the signal. Iran's regime, for a very long period, shut down the internet. But in the end, they cannot unplug and shut down a generation that knows how to reconnect. Third, courage is no longer isolated. And we heard it from Leopoldo and Massi. The activist in Caracas knows the dissident in Minsk. The student in Kabul draws strength from the lawyer in Moscow. What once were scattered sparks are now a widening flame. Fourth, accountability. Accountability once that was unthinkable. Today it's real. Finally, the EU designated sanctions on the IRGC. The dictator Nicolas Maduro is facing justice. It's not enough. It's not enough, but impunity is no longer automatic. Finally, tyrants can fill prisons, they can deploy police, they can block websites, but they cannot force people to believe them. They cannot make lies become truth, and they cannot stop free men and women from standing up again and again and again. So here at the Geneva Summit, truth still has a platform, and it matters. It matters. So I want to thank all of the ambassadors who joined us today and yesterday at the United Nations. We had many of them. We urge you, as Brandon said, take up their cases, take up their causes at the United Nations and elsewhere. It's very important. And finally, I want to thank our larger audience, all of you, students, citizens, activists, for being here. You know, one powerful way that you can make a difference is to expand our global audience online. Give voice to the voiceless. Go to the Geneva Summit accounts on YouTube, X.com, Instagram, and so forth, Facebook. Watch and share all of the videos from the speeches you heard today on the various pages. Follow our courageous speakers on their social media accounts. It's vital that you share their stories. Make sure that no one at the United Nations or in the international community can ever say, we didn't know. Don't let them say we didn't know. So I want to thank, finally, all of our dedicated interpreters, our photographers, videographers, logistique. And on behalf of our 30 co-sponsoring NGOs, I want to express our profound appreciation and gratitude to the entire incredible Geneva Summit team of staff and volunteers who worked so hard to make this happen, led by the incredible Chloe and Eileen for their superb work and dedication over many, many months. You gave your all over long days and late nights with meticulous preparations, creativity, devotion to our speakers to organize yet another magnificent and meaningful Geneva Summit. So with that, I thank all of you for supporting the 18th Annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. I look forward to seeing you next year at the 2027 Geneva Summit. In the words of Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel, quote, "We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." Thank you very much. I now invite all of the speakers, everyone who spoke today, please come up on stage for a group photo. Everyone who spoke on stage, please come up for a group photo. Please. First the speakers, and actually, yeah, thank you. Okay. All right, before we call up the rest on stage, do you want to hear? I want to, on behalf of all of our speakers, we want to invite the main organizer, Chloe, to please come forward to receive thanks and appreciation from all of the speakers. For doing an incredible job to organize this event. Picture, Chloe, come in the middle. Let's take a picture with, and now I want to invite all the staff, all the Geneva Summit staff and volunteers, please come up on stage. All of the Geneva Summit volunteers and staff, please come up on stage for the group photo. Some on this side too, if you like. Come, both sides. And you have to look at only one person's camera. It's Oliver. You don't see the cameras there. They're only Oliver's camera. It's the only one that you see. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hillel. Thank you to Human Rights Watch. I'm very glad to be, to UN Watch. I know. Thank you to UN Watch. Sorry, Hillel, for the mistake. And I know it's not a subtle one. I'm very honored to be here with colleagues from Venezuela, with Pedro, colleagues from the World Liberty Congress, with my friend, co-founder of the World Liberty Congress, and many others that we have become friends in the fight for freedom. We have become from victims to freedom fighters in a global fight for freedom, because it is global. As we have heard, this is not just about our countries, but it's about the global influence of Russia, China, Iran, and many other countries that expand autocracy and the violations of human rights. For years in this room, in this building, we have heard what has happened in Venezuela for years. And I've had the opportunity to come here and speak, thanks to you and watch. And I have witnessed that after proof of torture, political prisoners, persecution, killings, forced disappearances, massive protest, massive exile, I have seen with my eyes and heard with my ears the countries that stand up to defend the regime of Nicolás Maduro. I have seen Iran, China, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, Uganda, North Korea, going one after the other, just supporting the atrocities committed by the regime of Nicolás Maduro. And it's like an orchestra. When they come here and reports are presented, they support each other. We need to make the distinction between the people that make the reports, the NGOs, the professionals that go to the ground and risk their lives. Many of them work for the UN. But after they present those reports, unfortunately, nothing happens. Nothing happens. It's like an orchestra that is not heard. We have seen with shock and with joy, in the case of Venezuela, the capture of Nicolás Maduro, the head of a criminal organization that was torturing and subjecting our country of millions of people on January the 3rd. Venezuelans celebrated with joy. More than 80% of the Venezuelan people celebrated the capture of Nicolás Maduro. But very early, we started to hear some objections. Objections with words that become common in these halls. Objections saying that was done capturing a criminal responsible for thousands of people being killed, disappearances, thousands of people being sent to prison, massive exile, saying that his capture was a war crime. We also heard objections saying that what happened in Venezuela was a violation of sovereignty. A violation of sovereignty in a country that a year and a half ago celebrated the most sacred of all sovereignties, which is the sovereignty of the people. It's bewildering to hear people talk about sovereignty of a dictator and not defending the sovereignty of the people that voted, and we were able to prove that those were the results, and then they defend the stability of the dictator. We have heard claims about international law. People nervous about breaking the international law because of the capture of a dictator, of a criminal. The international law that did not support millions of Venezuelans while they were being victims of the crimes committed by Nicolás Maduro and his regime. So unfortunately, this international structure, these international laws, these international and multilateral buildings are not delivering to the people. They are certainly not delivering to the voices sitting here in this room today. And we have heard once and again from one country to the other that we are frustrated because it's only words, it's only paper, it's only tears, but no action. The world requires action. And we got action in Venezuela. And we celebrate that action. We celebrate the action led by the United States. And let me tell you something that might be shocking to many. More than 60% of the people in Latin America, not Venezuela, of Latin America, celebrate the capture of Nicolás Maduro. So something is happening. Something is happening. Maybe people are not listening, but the people that maybe 10 or 20 or 30 years ago had flags against the United States, today they were celebrating that Nicolás Maduro was captured. Iranians celebrated. I was in a call that day with my friend Bobby Wine. He was in the middle of an election. He called me. He was in his rally. And he said, let's go live. We went live. And he was saying in his rally, the same way Maduro left, Museveni is going to live. But what was the fate of Bobby Wine? The same fate that we had in Venezuela. He won the election, and the election was stolen. And we can go over and over with many of the other cases. But let me go back to Venezuela. Many people ask us, how are things in Venezuela? Simple, much better than they were on January the 2nd. Much better than they were on January the 2nd. But not where we hope them to be. They are not where we hope them to be. Because for years, we have been fighting for an idea that for some, it's theoretical. For us, it's vital. We have been fighting for freedom. And we understand what freedom is, not from theory, not from poetry, not from music. We learned what freedom is. I myself did when I was in a solitary confinement cell for 4 years and condemned to confinement for 7 years. And I understood that freedom is not one thing. Freedom is the sum of many things. Freedom is the possibility to do what I'm doing today that I cannot do in my country, to speak. Freedom is the possibility to move around. Freedom is the possibility to gather with whomever you want to gather. Freedom is the possibility to wear what you want to wear. In the case of Iran, Afghanistan, if women want to wear the hijab or not to wear it. Freedom is the possibility to believe in whoever you want to believe, or not to believe if you don't want to believe. And we just heard that there are hundreds of thousands of prisoners because of their belief. And freedom cannot happen without democracy. And democracy cannot happen without elections. So what we hope for, and what we are fighting for, and what we will deliver to the people of Venezuela, and what is the main responsibility of the Venezuelan leadership led by the legitimate elected president Edmundo González Urrutia, and the legitimate leadership of Maria Corina Machado, is to go to the people through a free and fair elections for the Venezuelan people to make that transition to democracy. That is our hope, that is our dream, that is our commitment, and that will be the good news that we will deliver to all of you. And we will know, and I'll end with this, that when Venezuela transitions to democracy, Cuba will transition to democracy, Nicaragua will transition to democracy, and the impact will be felt in Africa, in Asia, in Eastern Europe, and in the Middle East, because this fight, my dear friends, it's a global fight for freedom. So long live freedom, long live the political activists, the human rights defenders, and the women and the men that believe and give their lives to freedom, human rights, and democracy. Thank you very much.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez in Chicago. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
We begin today's show with Greg Grandin, history professor at Yale University, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, whose major new book is out this week, America, A New History of the New World. He describes as a, quote, history of the modern world, an inquiry into how centuries of American bloodshed and diplomacy didn't just shape the political identities of the United States and Latin America, but also gave rise to global governance, the liberal international order that today many believe is in terminal crisis, unquote. The book spans 5 centuries, from the Spanish conquest to the first Latin American pope, Francis, who was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Argentina, and just happened to die at the age of 88 the day before the book was released. The Nation has published an excerpt from America in a piece headlined, Pope Francis Upheld the Spirit of Liberation Theology. Greg Grandin also has a new piece for The Intercept that draws on the book headline, The Long History of Lawlessness in U.S. Policy Toward Latin America. He won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America. Professor Grandin, welcome back to Democracy Now! Congratulations on the release of your book. I want to begin with that incredible moment in the White House, in the Oval Office. There is President Trump sitting next to the Salvadoran president, who calls himself a dictator, Nayib Bukele. And the moment of the United States and El Salvador, what this represented in the culmination of U.S.-Salvadoran relations, even going back, and I'm sure you're going to go back further, to the 80s, when the U.S. supported the paramilitaries and the military in killing so many tens of thousands of Salvadorans. And now the relationship is around this notorious mega prison, where President Trump says he no longer has control over people he sends there.
Yeah. Well, what struck, a number of things struck me about that encounter in the White House. One was, you know, as you mentioned, Latin America is famous for the kind of form of political violence called political disappearance, in which people were literally just kidnapped off the street and disappeared by security forces. And back then, an element of that kind of crime was the government would deny any knowledge of it. And obviously that wasn't true. The government and the security forces were deeply involved in carrying out and executing the disappearances. But that deniability created another element of terror, the uncertainty where their loved ones have gone, whether among the relatives, among the survivors of the people who were taken. You know, government officials, people would waste their time going through labyrinth bureaucracies, asking questions, and the government officials say, who knows, maybe they went to Cuba, we don't know. And what struck me was Bukele is like, there was no deniability this time, right? Trump and Bukele was like, we got him, we know where they are, and we're not going to give him back. That kind of FU impunity is a different kind of terror, a different scale, right? That, you know, if the uncertainty of that first wave of disappearances created a kind of horror and suffering among people, this kind of performance of omnipotence. We have them, and you can't do anything about it. I also was struck by the glee in which they talked about it, the joking about it, like as if they were just talking about, you know, not even human beings, the dehumanization. That was another thing. And let me just also say, this is a little bit of a tangent, but Bukele does like to joke around and with a little bit of irony, although it's not ironic at all because it's true, that he's a dictator. And, you know, when FDR visited, Franklin Delano Roosevelt visited Vargas, the president in Brazil, who was a dictator, but was also building a kind of social state. He was a backer of social rights and expanding kind of social welfare to the working class. When Vargas and FDR met, there was a little protest against Vargas. Vargas whispers to Roosevelt, they call me a dictator, and Roosevelt whispered back, me too. And so they were joking about being dictators, but in a completely different circumstance, in the sense that they're building social rights, they're building a social state, they're expanding economic, welfare states and social rights to people. We have two people who are talking about themselves as dictators and acting as dictators as they dismantle what's left of the New Deal.
And Greg, of course, you're familiar, you've written in the past about this historylessness from the United States with regard to Latin America. And it seems to me that just the same cavalier attitude that was evinced in this discussion in the White House has been pretty much part and parcel. In fact, there are actually more U.S. troops now in Panama. Quietly, the Panamanian government has allowed some of the old military bases to open up again as a result of the pressure from the Trump administration.
Yeah, and they'll soon be in Ecuador also. Ecuador is, vying to be a second El Salvador in the sense of a kind of security outpost. This is all in the context of, in a way, of losing Colombia. I don't know if they've lost Colombia permanently, but a left-wing Gustavo Petro was elected president, and he was an old insurgent, and Colombia kind of no longer serving as a kind of forecastle of U.S. power in the region, and the United States now constituting El Salvador and Ecuador as these kind of places in which they're projecting military power. I mean, the bigger question here is if the United States really has given up its role as superintending a global liberal order, and the world is reverting back to these kind of spheres of power competitions, then Latin America becomes centrally much more important to the United States as a source of resources, as a security perimeter in which being able to use certain countries as military bases. It becomes that much more important as the world kind of fragments into these spheres of influence, Russia and China and whatnot. And so we'll see a lot more of that, I think, in Latin America in the coming years.
I'm wondering, I wanted to ask you specifically about the role of Guantanamo, because most Americans don't really grasp the fact that the United States is holding a military base in Cuba, really against the wishes of the Cuban government still after all of these years? What allows this to continue to occur?
Well, what allows it to continue to occur is just absolute raw power, the power of the United States. And the United States, when it took Cuba and it took Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Guam in 1898 in this war, Spanish war against Spain, it carved out Guantanamo as a military base, as a coaling station, you know, and it had an end date, and I think that end date passed for the least. But once the Cuban Revolution happened in 1959, the U.S. ignored it and just kept Guantanamo and as its own kind of you know, enclave within the revolutionary island. And of course, you know, Latin America has long been a place in which the United States, as a growing empire, has used as a receptacle to cast off its unwanted or the people that it considered kind of outside the pale of belonging to the nation. Prior to the Civil War, many people thought that the United States could avert a war over slavery by basically sending all its free people of color to Latin America, to Central America, to Mexico, to Panama, to Haiti, as a way of lessening racial tensions that of course didn't happen. In the 1990s, Guantanamo became the place where the U.S. held refugee Haitians following that country's coup against Aristide in inhuman conditions. And then, of course, during the war on terror, Guantanamo became synonymous with, you know, with a war that legal categories could no longer kind of organize, right? So there was no term for these prisoners who didn't belong to any, or we weren't fighting their nations, we were fighting them. So it came up with enemy combatants, and Guantanamo became the place in which they were housed. So there's a long history of this, of course, and yes, it's on the island of Cuba, and the irony of that, since Cuba is one of the few countries that have long resisted U.S. militarism.
And I wanted to, first of all, congratulate you on your new book, America, and also
between first the British and Spanish colonial system, and then between Spanish Republicans and the United States, gives rise to a set of political principles that become the foundation of the global order. You know, when people think of the founding of the United Nations or the founding of the League of Nations, or what they talk about, the rules-based order, they often look to Europe. They look to Europe's, you know, relationship with its former colonies, and that's the histories that get written. But you know, in many ways, you know, the ideas that become foundational to the world after the end of World War II were created in Latin America. When you think about it, Juan, the United States becomes a nation, a single nation on what they imagined to be an empty continent. Obviously, it wasn't an empty continent. Obviously, the Spanish Empire was still there. There was indigenous sovereignties across the plains and across the Rockies. And the United States revives the doctrine of conquest in order to justify moving west as fast as it can. Latin America comes into the world 6 republics, already a League of Nations. They come into the world already a United Nations. They have to learn. There was nothing like that in history. Europe wasn't like that. Europe was a collection of empires and monarchies that were then expanding their colonial reach, sending their gunboats into the Indian Ocean and flitting around China. Latin America was a true assemblage of bounded nations, and they had to learn how to get along. They both threatened each other, and they both legitimated each other. And they legitimated each other because if one republic could throw off Spanish Catholicism and declare itself independent, then another one could. But they threatened each other because under the old rules of law, what was to stop Argentina from doing what the United States was doing and said, we want the Pacific. Let's send us settlers settlers over across the mountains and start taking land from the Chileans or the Mapuche or whatever. But of course they weren't going to do that. They had to figure out a new theory of sovereignty, a new way of thinking about how nations live together. And one of the first things they came up with is the premise that nations aren't necessarily inherently competitive. They critiqued both the United States' doctrine of conquest and they critiqued the old world's balance of power, the presumption that the way you achieve stability and stasis is by each nation or empire pressing their interests, and that creates a kind of countervailing force. They thought that was inherently unstable and would always lead to war. What they came up with was a vision of internationalism in which the first principle was that nations shared a kind of common purpose, a shared set of interests, and that they could work together cooperatively through diplomacy. They also came up with the idea that the boundaries of the old colonial system were the boundaries that they were going to accept. They may not be perfect, they may have been imposed by the colonial system, but that's what we have. There's no frontiers, we're not going to be pushing. And now, in many ways, this was a kind of an ideal type of vision. There was plenty of wars in Latin America, particularly in the 19th century, and skirmishes. Brazil wanted rubber, and that was in Peru, and there was lots of border skirmishes. But all of those skirmishes were negotiated under the premise that the boundaries were real, that wars of conquest and wars of aggression were illegal. And all of these ideas are what eventually makes it into the United Nations Charter.
Greg Grandin, I wanted to ask you, follow up on you mentioning Argentina, and also follow up on the Pope. And it goes to a major theme in your book. Democracy Now! Broadcast from Buenos Aires for several days. We followed the mothers of the disappeared in the Plaza de Mayo, in the women who lost their children and grandchildren, demanding to know where they were. And you follow the position of the Catholic Church throughout Latin America, of extremely conservative force, but also the liberation theology that was so important, and they were counter to each other. Whether we're talking about the church allying with the U.S.-backed regimes in Guatemala and El Salvador. In El Salvador, of course, Archbishop Romero was gunned down March 24th, 1980. Argentina, that is where Pope Francis was from, the first Latin American pope. He was there during the Dirty War from 76 to 83. And I know there's controversy around it's quite murky what happened then and what his role was and his relation to liberation theology at the time. Could you go into this?
Well, yeah, I mean, Pope Francis in many ways was a quintessential Latin American. He was born during an era in which social movements, labor unions, and peasant leagues were entering the public sphere, demanding social rights. In his case, he grew up under Peronism. I don't know his position on Peron. I don't know whether his family was Peronist. I have no idea. But he certainly was immersed in that kind of, the bursting into the public sphere of the plebeian. And he was a priest through the Dirty War, as you said, and through all of the turmoil of the 1970s. And there is a murky period, and there's accusations and counter accusations, and it seems as if most of the forces of the left have whether the question was whether he did enough to protect other Jesuits as the head of the Jesuit order in Argentina against the dictatorship, and
particularly the story of two priests.
Two Jesuit priests, and one to his dying day believed that Pope Francis gave him up.
Named for St. Francis.
Yeah, named for St. Francis, and the other priest forgave and said, no, I believe he did all he could to protect to protect us and, as much as he could. He wasn't a liberation theologian. In fact, many thought he was conservative, and there was some talk when he was voted Pope that he was picked because he would serve as a counterforce to the political left, which at that time, if you remember, was Chavez and Kirchner in Argentina, and it was a very strong movement in Latin America in the middle of the 2000s, in the first decade of the 2000s, and but history has this way of working, which was amazing. So I mean, it was the same thing with Oscar Romero. When Oscar Romero was picked to be Bishop of El Salvador, he was picked because they thought he was conservative. They thought he would defend the status quo. The status quo. The landed class was very happy with Oscar Romero, and the experience of living in history has the tendency to radicalize people sometimes, and sometimes it radicalizes them in the right direction, in the more humanist direction, and that happened with Oscar Romero, and it happened, I think, with Francis.
And he dies right before giving that speech, which is broadcast throughout El Salvador, Archbishop Romero, directly addressing the Salvadoran military. Sadly, the U.S.-backed Salvadoran military, saying, "I urge you, I beseech you, I demand you put down your arms."
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's quite a heresy, right, to order your military not to obey their officers.
Greg, I wanted to ask you this debate between the humanist and elitist and conservative wings of the Catholic Church, as you note in your book, has a long history, and you spent quite a bit of time talking about the 16th century debates between two Dominican priests, Bartolomeo de las Casas and Francisco de Vitoria. What was the substance of that debate, and what's its importance historically, especially in terms of the impact that the native presence on America had on European thought?
Yeah, well, the book does start with the conquest, and it starts with the conquest and all of its horror and all of its suffering. I mean, we're talking, some demographers call it the greatest human mortality event in history. They estimate that there were probably about 90 million people living in the Americas, and within a century, 90% of them were gone. And Spanish Catholicism, when the Spanish Empire arrived and claimed dominion, claimed sovereignty, they knew they were presiding over a populated land. And it sparked a debate among the theologians about how to justify dominion. The reconquest of Iberia, the driving Muslims and Islam off of Iberia was justifiable because, what's that? Spain. Yes, Iberia, Spain. Was justified because they claimed that Spain was Christian before Islam arrived, and therefore what they were doing was just taking back land that had been taken from them. But they couldn't make that argument in the conquest, right? Because Native Americans hadn't known Christ, and therefore they couldn't deny Christ. And so they had to come up with a new justification for why Spain had the right to presume sovereignty over the Americas. And there was a small group of critics, including De las Casas, including Francisco Vitoria. Most of them were Dominicans, also Franciscans, that began to argue that you couldn't find any basis of legitimacy. You certainly had no legitimacy to enslave them, and there emerged, in the face of the horror of the conquest and all its unimaginable suffering, there emerged a critique, a quite cohesive critique against conquest, against slavery, almost a critique that almost went to the point of pacifism, and a critique that insisted that all humanity was one. Bartolomé de las Casas is famous for a line, all humanity is one. The actual correct English translation was something, or the whole human lineage is one, meaning lineage from Adam and Eve. But he insisted on the equality of people. There was no difference between Native Americans and Europeans in his mind. And this is the foundation, I argue, of modern political thought, and particularly his rejection of the doctrine of conquest. And now, why that's important, and I kind of trace that out through the book. And this by no means does it ameliorate any of the brutality of the conquistadores and what they did, and the enslavement of Native Americans, and that greatest human mortality event in human history that I mentioned earlier. But it did create and consolidate a pole within the Catholic Church that continued, an emancipationist, abolitionist pole that continued. And why it's important? It's important for a couple of reasons. One is it was important for the nature of the Spanish Empire within the Americas, which I can come back to. But later on, when Spanish American Republicans begin to break from Spain and set up their own independent nations, and then have to start contending with the United States, which is reviving the doctrine of conquest to justify its expansion west. These Latin American intellectuals and political leaders had already at their disposal a fairly coherent critique of conquest, a fairly coherent critique of slavery, that what had been applied to Spain, they then applied to the United States. And it's that tension and it's that kind of persistence of this ethic that becomes the foundation of the international order. Now, I'll also say the other thing that's specific about the Spanish Empire is that the Spanish Empire the Spanish Empire knew it was an empire over people. Native Americans were the main thing. They were the people who extracted the wealth out of the Americas and created the world's first universal currency, but they were also the center of Spanish moralism. They were, what the Native Americans were, as they were defined by theology, is what justified the Spanish Empire. Now, when you jump ahead a couple of centuries and you get to British colonialism, there's no discussion about Native Americans. There's no discussion about, the justification of how to justify colonialism. In fact, the London Company in 1607, when they were sitting around, they had a meeting and they said, well, maybe we should issue a document that justifies Jamestown and justifies, what we want to do in New England. And I have this debate, and fully aware that for a century, the Spanish have been debating this for a century. And they basically come to the conclusion, the Spanish priests, the Dominicans, and the theologians have been debating this for a century, and they still can't come up with a workable justification for Spanish conquest. So maybe it's better we don't say anything at all. We just keep our mouths quiet and just do it. So that evasion of responsibility is a major strut in the book.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. I want to talk about the role of Latin America in fighting fascism from the 30s until now. And also I want to ask you about the radical journalist Ernest Gruning. Greg Grandin is our guest, history professor at Yale University, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, whose new book is America, America, A New History of the New World. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're spending the hour with history professor from Yale University, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, whose book is out this week, America, America, A New History of the New World. Professor Greg Grandin is our guest. So let's talk. We talk about, Orban and Hungary. We talk about Holocaust. We talk about those who fought fascism in America and its key role, and what the United States, and especially those who are fighting the authoritarian tendency, can learn from our southern neighbor.
Well, Latin America had the good fortune of getting to fight fascism just as the New Deal was consolidating in the United States, and a shift in the way away from intervention, and a shift away from Washington defending U.S. capitalists and U.S. investment at all costs. So FDR had a much more eclectic approach to Latin America, and basically he gave the left room to maneuver in Latin America. I mean, Spain, in many ways, a lot of grand strategists were afraid that the kind of conflict that you saw in Spain between Franco representing a Spanish nationalism, Catholic nationalism, allied with Mussolini, allied with Hitler, and fighting a kind of more liberal currents with liberal and radical currents within Spain, was basically just a preview of a conflict that would eventually drift across the Atlantic and take over all of Latin America, because the sociology was very similar. Servile peasants, large landed landowners,